Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. So far in this series, we've covered most of the major components. In fact, there are just a few left, namely the conditional modifier selector and the active effects displayer. And we'll get to those later once we've covered items and modifiers in more detail. But for now, there are a ton of projects that I still want to show you all, like making the proficiency checkbox have a little bit of an icon when players aren't editing their sheets, changing the display of checkboxes overall to give them a custom design, and making our radio button trail to lower values. I also want to cover how to make magic items and racial bonuses, and even conditional CSS styling. So there's still a ton left to do, but for today's episode, I want to focus on getting our feet wet by making unique components or displays with custom CSS and HTML within our labels. Specifically, I want to make this segmented bar graph here. Before we get started, I'm going to try to cover the basics of HTML and CSS, but if what I'm saying doesn't click or if I'm just moving too fast for you, you're in luck. HTML and CSS are both fairly easy languages to learn, and there is a ton of resources on the internet just waiting for you. If you need a recommendation or are just curious of where I'd start if I were just starting all over again, I would check out the Odin Project. It's free, and I'm not even being paid to tell you about it. So if you put the time in, you could very easily be making things with these languages in just a week. On our template, I've already put a panel where I want this graph to go. So let's go ahead and start by adding our first label to it. The reason we're starting with a label isn't just to start with some kind of legend or title for this graph, but labels can actually just accept raw HTML straight into their text area, and that's what we'll be using today, which opens the door for a ton of different possibilities. To save ourselves some trouble down the line, I'm going to start by declaring a few variables so that we can reduce the clutter in our code, as well as just for ease of use later, since I'm going to be copying this graph for each of our stats and want to change our component key in just one place. The way that we declare a variable in CSB notation is to start by typing the name of our variable, followed by a colon and an equal sign. And whatever we type after this colon equal sign will be the variable's value. So in our case, I want to be able to enter our attribute key and it return the value of strength input for this first graph. That way, when I copy this for the other graphs, I only have to change it right here and not worry about finding each place that I reference the component key. Secondly, I'm going to create a new variable called segments, and this will show us the number of segments that are totally full. Luckily, in our case, our attributes are all going to be based on the number 5. Like our maximum attributes are 25. We have 5 segments of 5. So if we just divide our attribute score by 5, so let's say 19 by now, 19 divided by 5 is 3.8. So that means that we will have 3 full segments, and the fourth will be 80% full. That being said, we can use the floor function from Math.js to always round down. That being said, it doesn't matter if we're 3.999, it'll just give us the 3. As a reminder, CSB is built on Math.js, meaning we have access to all of Math.js without even leaving our regular CSB notation, so we don't have to use the % curly bracket here. Finally, for our third variable, I'll call segment fill %. And I want to get that 80% away from the 3. And there are quite a few ways that I could achieve that. But I think this is a great time to introduce the modulo function. The modulo function gives us the remainder after a division. In our example of 19, 5 will divide into 19 3 even times, which leaves us 4 units that were not consumed in that division. And that's where we get our 0.8 number from. And since we're working with 5s here, our modulo will only ever return 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. It can never return 5 or higher. And we can take that return and multiply it by 20 to either get 0, 20, 40, 60, or 80. And we can use that as what percentage of our next bar is full. The way that I built the logic for this is when we return 0, it could either be 0% full or 100% full. And there will be an extra if statement to catch that. So if we're ever working on a segment 3, 1 and 2 we know is going to be entirely full. Now, if we just stopped coding here, our variables would actually display on our character sheet, showing the value of strength input and its calculations. Let's go ahead and prevent that with our first venture into HTML. Above our variables, I'm going to go ahead and enter a less than sign, followed by the word span, and then a greater than sign. This is how you create a span element in HTML. HTML checks for keywords inside of the less than and greater than sign to create elements. And so what we just did is told it to consider everything after this tag to be a span. And then we'll tell it where the span ends by entering the span tag again after our variables, except for this time, we'll add a / before the word span, which is just telling it to cancel span. Everything between these two tags is now considered within the span. Now, a span is an inline element, meaning they don't actually take up space for themselves and are largely used to select text and group together smaller parts of bigger elements and style them. For example, span tags are very often used to tag colors, bold, or highlight text out of a paragraph without disturbing the spacing of the other words. In this case, we've selected our variables, and we can now visually remove them from our sheet while still having access to them in our label. We can tell HTML that we want to add CSS to certain elements by directly putting it inside of the tag, which is great for small tweaks. We'll do that by going back to our opening tag and typing style equals, and then 2 quotation marks. Anything between these 2 quotation marks will be read as CSS. CSS does look a little bit different than HTML, but it's still very readable to our eyes. It follows a very simple structure. What we want to change, followed by a colon, and what we want to change it to, followed by a semicolon. The colon and semicolon format helps to let CSS know when variables and values start and stop, so make sure to remember them. In our style quotes, I'm going to enter display, none, which is just telling CSS that our display variable should be set to none, which will effectively remove it from visual display of the sheet. Since the only thing we have in this label right now is a span that's not going to be displayed, be careful not to save it just yet, since you'll have an empty label that's going to be a pain to click and open back up since it's not taking up much, if any, space. Now, outside of our span, let's make a div element. A div element is another HTML tag that's probably short for divider or something, but it's used to group up elements and divide up sections of our sheet. In fact, the panels that we've been placing all of our sheet up to now are actually just divs. And just like spans, divs need to be closed out. But unlike spans, divs do take up space for themselves. Think about them like putting elements inside of a box. Even if it's an empty div like we're just now creating, the box will still itself take up space. We could just enter another style quote here and type our CSS directly into the div. However, it's probably going to be easier to make changes all in one place, especially because we're going to be using the same style for this div in multiple places. And also, unlike our invisible span tag, we'll probably want to come back and make changes to these values when we actually go to edit the page layout to look nice. So instead of just entering style into our opening div tag, let's enter class equals double quotes. Now, anything typed into the quotes will count as a class for the div. Do note that classes should not contain spaces in them because each new space will denote that we're typing a new class name. Classes are just repeatable styles, in the way that if we have multiple headings in our sheet that look the same, we can go ahead and reuse the class. But be careful though, classes cannot start with numbers unless you use special formatting rules. So we'll go ahead and just use one class here and we'll call it attribute segment graph, since it's going to be the container containing the attribute segment graph. We can create another div to represent the space that we want one segment to take if it were entirely full. This gives us some context to the segment's fill if we tell it that we want it to be 80% full. Without doing this, 80% full would be 80% of the entire width of the graph, and I only want it to be 80% full of 1/5. Doing it this way will allow us to create a static border around our segments that don't actually change with the fill, so that way we can visually grasp its value just at a glance. We won't actually be doing that since I like the cleaner look of not having the border. However, when you're making your sheet, feel free to do whatever you'd like. We'll give this div a class of segment parent, since it'll be the element directly above a segment fill. Inside of the segment parent, we'll go ahead and place the segment fill div. We'll start the same way by making a new div element and giving it a class of segment fill so that we can control the color and the height across all our graphs just within one place in our CSS. But we'll also go ahead and set the width inside of a style quote. The reason we're doing it inside of a style quote is because CSB does not directly read our style sheet for logic, so we'll have to do it within our label where CSB is reading and actively interpreting. To start, inside of our style quote, I'll enter width, since we're going to be modifying the width variable. But instead of setting it equal to a static value of, say, 10%, I'll use CSB notation and start with an if statement to determine what value it needs to be at any given time. Going back to our variables, we already know how many segments are currently full. So we're going to check if the current segments are equal to 0, as in there are no currently full segments, meaning the first segment that we're building right now must not be entirely full. So if segments is equal to 0, we want the width to be equal to segment fill. That way, if the first segment is, say, 20% full, it'll import the width here and be 20% full. But if segments is not equal to 0, we want to check and make sure that it's greater than the number that we are currently filling in. Otherwise, this would allow negative overflows or just confusion of making multiple segments 80% full rather than always having the previous segment full. So if segments is equal to 0, set it equal to segment fill. else, we're going to start another if statement, and just to make sure our nesting is always correct, I am a little excessive and I'll add an extra CSB notation here. So else segments is greater than 0, it is 100. And if somehow we have a negative return for segments or something else happens, segment will return 0% full. So if we have a negative strength score somehow, regardless of what happens, it'll just not display anything being full here. And we'll close everything out. And then we're going to close the div tag here. We're going to close the segment parent div tag, and we're going to copy it and paste it again. We're going to do it 3 more times, so I have a total of 5 segment graphs. And now I'm going to go back to each one and change the numbers. So for the second segment, I'm going to go ahead and say if segment is equal to 1, as in we have 1 total full segment. Then we need this one, the second segment, to be set to segment fill. Else, if it's greater than 1, it's either full or empty. And just continue to make those changes down the line with segments 2, 3, and 4. Now we have 5 segments that work independently to determine whether or not they need to be a % full, entirely full, or empty. And we're going to go ahead and close out our very first div that we made, the segment score graph. Just make sure everything is closed out and opened properly. And we can go ahead and save this element. Now, you might not see anything right now, and that's because we haven't told our CSS what colors we want things to be, how wide it needs to be, and so it's going to look pretty much empty. So I'm going to start by targeting our score segment graph class by typing period to tell CSS that it's a class. And I'm going to type in score segment graph, just like we declared the class name earlier. And if this was an ID, we'd use a hashtag. If it was just an element, like we want to target all divs that could possibly exist, we would just type div with no prefix. But like I said, this is a class, so period dot score segment graph, space, and then a open curly bracket, close curly bracket. Now everything typed in between that open and close curly bracket will be read as CSS for that class. So I want to do our minimum width equal to 100%. Just like we did earlier inside the style tags, this time I'm making sure it's min width, as in minimum width, colon, space, 100%, semicolon. So our width of the entire graph will be 100% of its available area. The height I want to set to 10 pixels, just so something has height declared, rather than letting CSS think maybe it's 0 pixels or some other attribute figuring out the actual height for us. I want to actually explicitly say be 10 pixels. And now if I were to stop here, our segments would display vertically in a column, and I want them to display in a row with a bit of spacing to get that segmented bar look. And the way I'm going to do that is by setting the display property to flex. And what that's going to do is give us a lot of extra CSS variables that we can change the way that this is displayed, one of which is going to be flex direction, and I'm going to set that to row, and that's going to force it to display left to right rather than up and down. And to get that nice segmented look, I'm going to make sure that the flex condition knows that I want there to be a gap of 7 pixels between each element, and that will give us our nice segmented look. Now, outside of our curly bracket, I'm going to go ahead and target the next class and say segment parent. And keep in mind that is the size of a full segment. And I'm going to give it a width of 15 pixels and a height of 10 pixels. That way, even if it's 0% full, 20% full, it doesn't matter. It knows it's of this space. It's contextual percentage. It also knows to reserve that space. It will always be like 5 segments that are there, even if 4 and 5 are not full, so it's not expanding and doing weird stuff. So after that, I'm going to go ahead and target our segment fill. And normally I would advocate using RGB colors, but in this case, just so I can visually display that it's there, we can go back and change colors later. The orange color is close enough to the end result anyway. I'm going to set its background color. Notice it's background color and not color, because if you just did color, that's text color. So background color is like highlighting behind text or just filling area, which is exactly what we want to do right now. Background color is equal to orange. And again, might be a bit redundant, but I want to set the height equal to 10 pixels here as well. That way every element knows it is 10 pixels tall. Nothing will be shrunk too small or too big. And we can go ahead and save our CSS and refresh our character sheet. and try a few different numbers in our strength input number field. Let's try a negative number, and it looks like everything is working exactly like expected. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this component by holding Control and dragging and dropping it for each attribute, and then just changing the variable at the very top of what attribute key it needs to be referencing. And there we go. Now we have our 4 working graphs for our attributes. So I hope this tutorial was helpful in learning how to do custom HTML, custom CSS, and how to actually inject that and use that within CSB to do some cool stuff, make your own components. We'll be getting into a lot more cool stuff with this later, but this is just the introduction, bare bone basics of how to make something cool and custom. So if regular components aren't doing it for you, or you find the regular meters too restrictive, this is how you get around that and actually make really cool, interesting displays. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, don't forget to comment and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. We're just about to crack 200 subscribers at the time of recording. So thank you all so much and have a good rest of your day. Happy building.